So, one of the challenging things about being a person who has been lost is that you find yourself in a predicament where maybe your voice could get outside of the space where you reside in, but very rarely can people see a depiction of that moment where you first got lost. And so what I want you to do right now is listen to my voice, but focus on the screen. The screen will be blank for a second. So, I have a friend named Roger Fentress. I met Roger in 1997. We were part of a cadre of young men tried as adults and sent to prison with adults. And the thing that was peculiar about Roger, who everybody called Fats, was that he said that he was innocent. And I know that we're in a moment of mass incarceration where a lot of people like to think that they care about men and women in prison. And I know that for the most part, that caring is hooked and connected to an innocence that is really not the dominant theme of incarceration. And I know that I spent a lot of my time doing advocacy work bristling against our need and our desire for people to be innocent. I bristled against that because I recognize that what makes us want to help somebody is if we feel like they're blameless. If you know that a person held the pistol and put it up against somebody's head and demanded their car keys and demanded their wallet, it's really hard to say that the place for them is not prison. And so I work really hard to make that the center of everything I do, to change the focus of how we think about people who are innocent. So you have to imagine that I was thoroughly surprised when I got a letter from Fats. Now again, I knew that he was so unlike most people that I knew while incarcerated because he held on to this idea that he was incarcerated for a murder that he didn't commit. And he was doing 56 years for a murder that he didn't commit. But I had that fact in the back of my head, and I just didn't let it trouble me while I was incarcerated. And when I came home, I thought about it essentially never. And then I went to law school. And the grapevine got to some folks that I know in prison, and it got to Fats. And Fats asked a friend of mine if he could write me. So he writes me a letter. And like everybody else, I had seen Shawshank Redemption. And so I knew about Andy Dufresne. I knew about the young kid who had committed the murder that Andy was locked up for. I knew that the young kid was willing to go to the authorities and confess to the murder. I remembered what happened to the young kid when he told the authorities that he had committed the murder. Still, when Fats sent me an affidavit that was filled out by another prisoner, and he said, "Can you get me a lawyer? The guy who committed the murder is actually in here. He is willing to tell everybody that he was the one responsible. He has proof. Will you do something?" I said, "Sure," but I fundamentally doubted that the affidavit would move anything. And I got the affidavit. And the goddamn thing was written in print. And I thought to myself, who the fuck is gonna believe an affidavit that is written in print? Some of you guys will buy my book, maybe all of you, at least 80% of you. You'll see my signature. It makes me look distinguished. I want you to ask yourself, would you still respect me if I printed my signature in careful block letters? The affidavit that I had was written in print, and it was signed in block letters by a dude that was already doing life. I'm in law school. I was being taught to think like a lawyer. So I thought, this is bullshit. This will not help you. That's also my man. So I said, I got you. I called some people. And I did. I called a bunch of people. I got connected to some folks from an Innocence project, had a long conversation with them. I scanned the affidavit, sent it to them, talked to the person. The person says, Dwayne, we so love your work. We've been hearing about you for years. What do you plan on doing after law school? It's like, this conversation is supposed to be about feds. They said, oh yeah, the affidavit, we read that, no court's gonna accept that. The guy already has a life sentence, why wouldn't he lie? And I thought, lost. What does it mean to be lost? What does it mean to be unraveling? And what does it mean to have some information about a person's life that now you're unwilling to share with them? Because I decided that I would not be the one to tell facts, that the lawyer said that the affidavit was bullshit, that the lawyer said that as much as we love Shawshank Redemption, and as much as we were moved by Shawshank Redemption, when the shit happens in real life, we discount it. We aren't willing to figure out how to do any type of research to see if it's some indicia of truth to the affidavit. But an interesting thing happened. It was a journalist named Brad Zinn, who was writing a piece on facts. And the piece just revealed so much about this man's life that I didn't know. It revealed that his IQ at the time was like in the mid to high 60s. It revealed that the police officer the detective never even interviewed him once they arrested him for the homicide. It revealed that he was dealing with chronic homelessness and that his mom was mentally ill. It just basically demonstrated that if you wanted to pin a crime on somebody, he was the perfect patsy. I should say that this was 1996, and that meant that he was a super predator anyway. And I love how audiences bristle at that language now, as if they weren't alive in 1996, when that language dominated the way we thought about the criminal justice system. When the article came out, I sent it to her. And they immediately took Fat's case. And it was a beautiful thing, really. One, it reminded me that people who I think are, in the best cases, represented by the work of journalists, it reminded me that people can make things happen where the law consistently and expectedly fails. Because my training was teaching me to think like a lawyer, and thinking like a lawyer dictated that Fat's innocence did not matter at all. When I was asked to come back and talk, I decided that I was just going to talk about Fat's because I think his story captures the dilemma that I confront all of the time. What does it mean to want to help somebody and not know what to do? And also, what does it mean to devote so much of your life to a profession that consistently fails? And so what happened after the lawyers took his case is he had to file a habeas corpus petition. But the reality is that everything that was in that article that made his innocence plausible was inadmissible in court. The victim was dead. The woman who drove with the victim had committed suicide. The cop turned out to be dirty. He was under investigation. He had also committed suicide. The prosecutor had long moved on. Prosecutor actually wrote a letter saying that it's serious questions about whether or not Fetz is actually guilty. And even if he is guilty, he shouldn't be in prison any longer. The prosecutor wrote this letter, gave it to Fetz's attorney. David Zinn wrote another article. That letter was in a newspaper. And what fucked me up though, right, is the prosecutor wrote this letter and didn't even put a goddamn heading on it. And I thought, we discounted the affidavit that was written by the guy who said he committed the crime, but we are going to give credence to a letter written by a prosecutor who doesn't even fucking know how to put a return address, like a heading on a letter. I was like, my 10-year-old kid knows better than to do this. And I thought the lawyer must know better, but the lawyer wasn't fighting for his own freedom. So anyway, Fetz is still struggling. The thing is, what I'm most impressed about is he's still desires to be free, but he still desires to be a part of the world. He called me one day, and I was busy. And I was like, man, look, I got something going on. Let me give you a call back. And I hung up, right? Somehow, I forgot that when I answered the phone, it said, you have a collect call from such and such in the such and such Department of Corrections. I had forgot all of that. And I forgot that I pushed 0, and I forgot that I had to wait an extra beat for him to even come on the phone. But the thing is, once I answered it, I didn't want to hang up immediately because I didn't want him to think that I hung up on him. So I waited for his voice to come on. I said, man, I got something going on. It's an emergency. I'm gonna hit you back. And I hung up. And then when I hung up, I realized that I wasn't gonna call him back because he was in a land where you can't call people. He was in a land where both his voice and his experience has almost disappeared completely. So later on that night, he called me, and I'm gonna end with this story, and I'm gonna end with a poem. Later on that night, he called me, and he said, bruh, is there anything I could do? And I was like, huh? He was like, remember, I called, you said that you had something going on, and I just wanted to know if it was something I could do to help. And I started laughing at his generosity, because I was humbled by the fact that he could be in the middle of a 60-year sentence, and that he had spent the last 3 or 4 hours waiting to call me back to ask me if he could give me some help. A little bit after that, he wrote me a letter. And I'm reading the letter, and the letter became the basis of this last poem. A lot of times I am down, and I actually have no hope for ending mass incarceration. I think about the presidential elections right now and realize that it's not even a subject of conversation at all, right? I think about the fact that the one time that all of the candidates had a criminal justice forum, it was headlined by Donald Trump. That shit is so funny. Can you imagine that, he is gonna run as the criminal justice reform candidate? How harrowing is that? He is gonna say that he released more people from prison than President Barack Obama. He's not gonna be lying. That has to trouble everybody. And it has to demand that we do so much more than what we're doing. But I get this letter from Fetz, and he's describing these dudes that I know. And he's like, yo, Star here, Juvie here. And he's describing them being at a table. It's very easy for me to forget how old I am, except when I'm around people like you guys. You look at my first book published 10 years ago, has my face on the cover. Never put your fucking face on a book cover. Never, right? The first book has my face on the cover. People say, damn, how old were you when you wrote that? And what they seem not to understand is they're saying that in the face of how old I look now. And I'm like, I don't know what you're suggesting. And they're like, well, no, it's just that you look so much, oh. You have children now, huh? And I'm like, yeah. And I got like 10 gray hairs for each child. But I forgot that they got old too. I forgot that I've been out of prison for 15 years, and each one of the days that I've been free, I guess it's 15,000 or so. Fetz, Juvie, Star, Absolute. All of these guys that I grew up with have still been in prison. And so he's telling me that he's sitting at the table with them, and he's talking about how their hair had become gray. And I do this thing where when you read a letter, you also predict what the next sentence is. And so I'm reading this letter when he talks about his hair becoming gray, and what I'm thinking about is all of the life that I've lived out here. And what does it mean to have lost all of that time? But Fat says something at the end that so profoundly fucked me up that it made me realize again what we might learn from the people who are suffering the most is often about the hope that they have for change. And that cynicism is a product of the law. It was cynicism that made me believe that the person who is saying I murdered somebody must be lying. As if you just got motherfuckers in prison that's like, I'm willing to confess to any murder. It doesn't actually happen. Like, even if you're already doing life in prison, that doesn't mean that you want to own some shit that you didn't do. But I started thinking about his situation just like everybody else tends to think about these situations. As if something happens to you when you get locked up, that you lose all your sense of humanity and morality, and you're just willing to fall on every sword for any reason. And so, a poem about that moment. Essay on reentry for Fats, Juvie, and Star. Fats ain't never killed nobody, but has known more years in cells than cities, than school, than lovers, than his favorite cousin lived. More years than freedom. We met before M ran his time up over a 5-inch black and white. Before K broke somebody's jaw with the lock in the sock. Back when everyone thought they'd go home. Before T went home and was murdered. Before J went home and came back. He gives me the math on men I did my bid with. Yesterday I sat at a table with Star, you remember him. I was looking at his balding head and he was looking at the grays that cover my crown. I looked at Juvie at a near table, both crown and beard stubble completely gray. We first discovered cells decades ago as teenagers. And just today, a mirror reminded me of my disappeared self. Androgenic alopecia, a word for our vanishing hair. Latin describing how time will cause everything to recede. No word exists for the years that we've lost to prison. And I thought, Fats describing a moment he shared with men he's known for decades, was thinking about all that lost. But he writes, looking at that landscape of gray that had become them, he realized it was far from over. Because all these rounds later, prison ain't still undefeated. And one of these days, we might find us some free. Now, I'm going to end this by saying that the true tragedy is you not only get lost in prison, but your story gets lost in prison. The thing that gives Fats the possibility of freedom is that somebody might hear his story and care. Brad Zinn, a reporter for the Virginia Pilot, wrote 3 articles about Rojai Fentress. That's R-O-J-A-I Fentress, F-E-N-T-R-E-S-S. You could Google his name. You could read those stories. And it frankly doesn't matter if you don't have money to support his freedom. It frankly doesn't matter if you don't have skills that you could call the Virginia Innocence Project and say, I want to offer these skills to help Fats get free. What matters is that you will know his story and you will share it with 3 people or 5 people or 10 people. And I get it. It's 1.7 million people in prison. All of them, we do not deserve to wear the burden of their incarceration any longer. I get that. I get that the moral question should not be about whether or not somebody deserves to be incarcerated, but whether or not we deserve to have to wear that burden. And I don't think we do. So we shouldn't. But to not wear the burden, we must hear more stories, and we must start with one individual. So what I suggest is that this conversation I've just had is about being lost, but in fact, what it is about you finding another narrative that might move you through the day, understanding that knowing that narrative and sharing that narrative might help him get him some free. Thank you.